Good evening. I'm Carol Olson Day of the New York Times. Welcome to the 11th Annual Arts and Leisure Weekend. We are so pleased tonight to have as our guest one of the record industry's most influential and important leaders. He discovered and signed some of the most talented musicians of the past 50 years, from Janis Joplin to Aretha Franklin to Annie Lennox to Alicia Keys, and that's just a few. His industry has awarded him its highest accolades, including 4 Grammy Awards and a Lifetime Achievement Grammy. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000, and in 2010, the theater in the Grammy Museum in LA was named after him. He's a native New Yorker and a major contributor to the arts scene in the city. And last year, in recognition for his work, he received an honorary PhD of Fine Arts from New York University. You'll hear much more about him in just a moment, but first, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator. He is one of our paper's esteemed film critics, but music fans know his perceptive music and nightclub reviews in Arts and Leisure and the Daily Arts Guide. Before joining the Times in 1988, he was a pop music critic and journalist for Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, and The Atlantic, and many other publications. A man of many talents, he's a Grammy winner himself for his collaboration on album notes for The Voice, a Frank Sinatra anthology. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Holden and our very special guest, Clive Davis.
Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Clive Davis, as probably everyone here knows, is the de facto king of the record industry. And he has a unique perspective that I don't think anyone else has now or has ever had, because he's been in it for, well, he joined CBS in 1960 and established himself as a great record man in 1967 when he went to Monterey and discovered all these Janis Joplin and signed them all to Columbia. And has kept going and running things and signing more and more great acts and producing them. He's been a star longer than all of his almost everyone he signed. It's kind of extraordinary. It's a unique career. So I'm going to start asking him questions about the business, because no one knows what's going to happen to the business since it went through its technological revolution. And, but there are signs now, in 2011, there were signs that the business was leveling off from its steep plunge. Maybe 50% maybe, was it, in revenues in the last 5 years. It's been terrifying to people, and the industry has changed. So I wanted to ask Clive, who knows more than anybody else about this, has been around longer than anybody else, what he thinks about the present and the future.
Okay. First of all, let me say how grateful I am that the Giants had a good second half. I feared if it was a cliffhanger, there'd be nobody out there at all, including a reluctant me. It's true that these have been a scary trend. The good news is that this very year, for the first time, the business has gone up, where we've had an increase over the past year. Another piece of good news was that an artist like Adele can break big and sell 5.5 million copies here and slightly more than that abroad. So you have an album selling 12, 13, 14 million on a worldwide basis. Also, the digital album sales increased by the strongest percentage in recent years. The CD lasts, the CD continues. It's a slow, steady decline, but I'm encouraged by two things. One, I'm encouraged by the recent year where for the first time we've gone up, and then I'm encouraged by knowing that music is such a part of our lives. It's not exactly being involved with a product when you hear those decline figures that you say, is the product, I hate to refer to music, but is the underlying product relevant for the future? That I know in my heart, that I know in my being, that it is, that music is as much a part of our lives today as it ever was, and it's needed all over the world. So I think that the need for it is strong, the relevance is strong, and there is the current year's figures which are healthy. The figures are healthy.
What's your attitude about someone like Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs is, I think, to the younger generation, what the Beatles was to my generation. An idol, a true god. And some people see him as a destroyer and others see him as a creator. Of course, he was very creative, but I mean, destroyer of the music, of the record industry. Do you see him positively or negatively or mixed?
I think over a period of time, there was some mixed reaction. And not to him, I've never met him. I've just been reading his book, fascinated by the book and the job that Walter Isaacson did in his telling of his life, and seeing, you know, the pitfalls in the time when he was at Apple and then had to leave Apple and then had to return to Apple, and the various wars, you know, that he had to conduct. But basically, other than at the beginning, when it was clear that the pricing, let's say, of a digital single was definitely a fight, that it was difficult to know whether it was more to sell the hardware than it was to promote music. But that has a way of evolving, and the 99 cents went up on a variable pricing level to $1.29 for that one cut. But you don't fight the future, and he was the future, and he is a visionary, and that certainly we all know that his place is very secure as being one of the great visionaries of our time.
I used to work in the record industry myself in the mid-'70s for 3 years, and was very unhappy there and left it. But I've known Clive since the '70s. And marketing of records has changed a great deal since that time. I think it has, because in those days MTV didn't exist at all. And getting tour support for a band was the most important thing, and finding a hit single was the most important thing in those days. And Clive was the expert, the #1 believer in getting the hit single. Are the priorities of marketing music, have they changed a great deal since then? Is television now the #1 marketing tool?
No, I would say that the importance of radio and the album sales being affected by a hit single, without question, I think is still the most important ingredient. So with all of the changes, and there have been many, so that there is obviously a role to be played. Television, whether it be the video, whether it be the internet, obviously, and the exposure, on the web for the videos definitely help. And there are dramatic examples, if you have something special, of some word of mouth breaking television, the role that reality shows have played, primarily the first several years of American Idol. But when you want to track what an album is doing, you do primarily still have to look for how many hit singles are in that album. And you take the example of Adele today, the fact that she has had several hit singles. It's not just the album coming out of nowhere, and she's made very few appearances. I mean, it's not that she supported it either by a tour or by television appearances, but the fact that digitally, Rolling in the Deep is about 5.5 million units in this country alone. Someone like you, she's had 2 or 3 singles that are each above 3 to 4 million units, so that I would say, if I had to grade it, the hit single, I think, is still the most important ingredient. I would want to add in this type of evening or discussion that there are a number of artists today, because of the nature of the music, that are not album sellers. It's not just technical. It's not that they're not interested in buying albums, but that you've got to stoke the curiosity of the listener that they want to hear more. And that with Top 40 so electronic, so dance-oriented, you're not breaking the kind of artist that really stokes the curiosity and motivates getting the artist to buy getting the consumer to buy the album, so that the hit singles are the most important, but there are many examples today of artists with hit singles who still don't sell albums proportionate to their single sales.
American Idol is one of the most extraordinary phenomena since, I don't know, since the disco era produced the top 3 hits by the Bee Gees or something like that, or Saturday Night Fever. And RCA is all involved with American Idol. How independent is Simon Cowell and his entourage from RCA? How closely do you work with him? And when his artists are signed to RCA or one of the other labels, are you always involved with them? Do you pick and choose them? How does that work?
Let me just correct one thing to bring your example or analogy up to date, because
Right.
Simon Cowell is no longer with American Idol, so you've got
right, all right, but until
So that-
this year.
So Simon now has X Factor, so that,
Are you involved with that?
well, I just was on the show. He asked me to just come and be introduced a few weeks ago. I embraced American Idol when it first came out, and when still the producer sole credit went to Simon Fuller. And I did because at that time pop music was not getting played on the radio as much. You were not able, there were no new Streisand's or Barry Manilow or Neil Diamonds, and music had changed so much and was far more urban-oriented, hip-hop-oriented. And so therefore, pop music was not getting exposure. And I felt that when I was offered the opportunity to, for the first 6, 7 years, to go on the show each year, to mentor the artists, to work with the winner and the runner-up, that I would use that principle, because I think at the beginning, Simon Fuller felt that the origin of what we call the 360 deal, where let's own the copyrights, let's do the merchandising, let's get all the touring rights. And outside the United States, it was looked in that manner, whereas I felt if I were going to work with an artist, I don't know how to work with an artist who doesn't write, to find material, the best material out there. So yes, at the very beginning, I did use my professional credibility to go to writers and say, this is not a fad, this is not just going to be cheese. It was being relegated. What kind of winner of a TV show can be anything lasting? So I took it very seriously, and I did find, with my A&R staff, singles beginning with Clay Aiken or Ruben Studdard that went to the top of the charts. And we found that the soundtrack album, or the souvenir aspect of American Idol, was about 500,000. But if you had a hit single, a meaningful hit single, the sales could be 1.5 million, 2 million or more. And so beginning with Clay Aiken, going through Ruben Studdard, going through Fantasia, Kelly Clarkson is the best example, where finding material for them and having hit singles. Kelly Clarkson's Breakaway album not only sold 5.5 million in America, but we broke her abroad as just a brand new artist with a very strong voice. So that album sold 11 million copies on a worldwide basis. So that commercially, was it valuable to BMG and ultimately Sony BMG? Extremely valuable. And at the time, I know they were very grateful because we validated the prize. If you don't have a prize that's worth something, it's one thing to declaim, as they're doing on X Factor now, that it's a $5 million recording contract. But when you, at the beginning, to be taken seriously and to know that these artists were able to compete, we did find hit singles for them. It validated American Idol. It validated the contest and the competition. And it became certainly and heralded this era where TV exposure is very critical and key.
How much does it cost to break a new artist now? How much money do you have to spend on a new artist with a new album for it to break even? $1 million now, or more?
You're probably going to have to come in a general sense, because every artist is really different. And I would say that between recording costs, marketing, and everything, it certainly for each signing would be up to $1 million. And that usually, if you have to do a very, very, very rough rule of thumb, you're talking about breaking even by selling 500,000 albums in order to recoup.
That's very, very, very challenging. Back in the 70s, it was 50,000, wasn't it?
I don't think it was ever 50,000.
You don't think it was ever 50,000? Well, album budgets were, at least at RCA when I was working there, which is 1976, 75, were minuscule. They were like $30,000 often.
Yeah, I would say that usually, even going back to that period of time, that especially if you're going to get into tour support and if you're going to get into the marketing, it was rarely the case that you didn't have, unless you just made a singles deal, but it was rarely the case that you didn't have to sell 250,000 albums in order to break even.
Let's talk about the role of the producer. There are arranger producers who arrange songs for artists. There are engineers. There are conceptual producers, all types. What kind of producer are you? What is your particular gift as a producer that makes you, win four Grammys for producing? As an idea man, a song finder, a discoverer of the arranger, or all of those things?
Over the years, I've only taken the credit, been given the credit of a producer if I found songs for the artist. So that clearly, and that I think generally is what I've been known for, of finding songs for artists that don't write. But I've got to say, or add for the record, that at Columbia, almost 90%, maybe more, of the artists that I signed were rock artists. That's what's gotten me into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And so when you're dealing with a rock artist who write their own material, and I'm talking about, you know, whether it was Springsteen or whether it was Earth, Wind and Fire or Luggins and Messina or Blood, Sweat and Tears, Chicago, Santana, I never would be involved in those cases in any producer capacity. But beginning with Arista, when I decided that the art, A&R means artist and repertoire, so that I would do, since rock, you've got to wait for that star to come along. You've got to wait for that creative genius to come along who writes that material, who is unique, and who is special. And so I decided that I would look for material and the repertoire side of it, so that if I did an album, any of the Whitney albums, as an example, or an Aretha Franklin, and if I found every piece of material, every song, not that they would automatically go in, because then I would sit down like you and I are talking right now, and I'd play each one for Whitney, you know. And a few times, we found from the beginning that we were very much in sync, whether she just trusted me or not, but there were only maybe 2 or 3 occasions where she said, I'm just not feeling that song. But otherwise, if I found that, if I picked the line producer, because when you're running a company and you're running promotion and sales and marketing or supervising it, as competent as you must have a great team around you, you can't go in the studio. But as soon as it was recorded, the track is sent to me. So that even in the summer, I had habit, still have actually, of going to Capri. There was a studio right on the hill above, and they would come running down with the DAT, and I would listen to it, and I would call and say whether I felt they nailed it, whether I felt the tempo was right, whether I felt they went off melody, so that, you know, both the idea of finding the song, finding the line producer, and then critiquing it, and as I envisage, because if we had the equipment, which we don't this evening, I would play for you demos of songs the way they come into me, you know, demos of what they sounded like before the arrangement to Cole, when we changed the tempo, when someone like a Whitney or Aretha found meaning that the composers didn't even know that they were there. And so in my case, it's been somewhat different, but only because I'm only occasionally in the actual studio. But the role of finding songs, going over tempos, picking the final take is very much in the same manner. It's all personally very hands-on in that connection.
Does the music video matter as much these days as it did at the height of the MTV era, or more or less?
I would say less than the height of at the height of the MTV era, but it's still very significant and important. And it's a little difficult to tell right now because there is a crisis in certainly the areas of rock, certainly looking at the audience of rock stations, or the diminution or the contraction of rock stations around this country. Where is the next Springsteen coming from? Where is the next Dylan coming from, as compared to, you know, as our music has become a little similar to what Europe was for many years, electronic and dance oriented, so that the challenge is not just, as so often reported, you know, whether the business is only a single business. It is really to come up with those artists that have substance and depth. And if Adele is any example, where we feel, when using the vernacular, you know that she's a quality artist. You know that she's gonna do so well at the Grammys this year because she's special and unique. And when that talent shows itself, look what the album sales potential can be.
When did you embrace hip hop, and how did it happen?
I was doing, let me go back a little in history to do that. Here I became head of Columbia Records with no musical training. And, you know, most of my signings were rock-oriented, but I wanted us to be in urban music. And so I couldn't do it, clearly. And so I went to Gamble & Huff. We established Philadelphia International Records, and we had the OJs and Teddy Pendergrass with Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and me and Mrs. Jones with Billy Paul. And so we were in R&B music. My only signing in the urban influenced area was Earth, Wind & Fire before I formed Arista Records. When I formed Arista Records, I used the model of what I had done at Columbia, because we were in every area of progressive music with Miles Davis and Mahavishnu Orchestra and Weather Report. And so I went to GRP, I went to Dave Grusin and Larry Rosen in the area of progressive music for Angela Bofield and for Tom Brown, Funkin' for Jamaica. But R&B, we started first with Ray Parker Jr. and You Can't Change That, and Jack and Jill, and then Aretha Franklin, and Dionne Warwick was first, you know, where I used to get 2 songs in every Barry Manilow album, because he thought that, and he could, that he is first and foremost a composer. So I'm giving you a little background where, having gotten into the song-finding business and having had great results with Dionne, when I was over my quota for 3 years with Manilow, so I came up with I'll Never Love This Way Again, and I was not going to wait 4 years, so I decided I would sign Dionne, and had Barry actually produce that record. That led to Aretha, that led to Whitney. By the first 2 albums of Whitney Houston, each sold over 21 million copies worldwide, hit after hit after hit. 7 consecutive #1 records, broke every record. It was in that period that urban and R&B music was changing. It was that period where the producer, usually slash songwriter, was doing his or her thing. And I realized that Whitney was subject to the criticism of being America's sweetheart or no soul. And so through that relationship with L.A. Reid and with Kenny Edmonds, Babyface Edmonds, that we started LaFace Records. They were thrilled that they, after 19 #1 R&B records, that they had their first pop hit with I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. And we were selling millions of albums for Whitney Houston. So LaFace, blue-collar R&B music, signing TLC, signing Usher, working with Outkast, that it gave that first flavor, that introduction. And I try to keep on top of every trend. As soon as a record hits the charts in any category, every week I bring that home. To this day, every weekend I spend listening to make sure, if I'm in the game, that I don't go over the hill, you know, and seeing that. I always tell the artist I get paid a lot of money to worry, and I worry, you know, you don't take for granted, you don't be cocky about it, you always feel. From the beginning of my life, when I had to work on scholarship to get through school, after my parents died when I was in the teen years, that you expect nothing and that you work for everything. And so it was in that period knowing that my skill, you got to know what you got, you got to know what you don't have. You got to know what you know and what you don't. It was not my field of expertise. I was not living the life. And so I got a call from a business manager, Bert Purdell, to meet a young guy, 21 at the time, Puffy Combs. And I met Puffy, and I was very impressed with his vision. And he was just leaving Uptown Records. I think he had been let go. There had been some controversy there. But one, he took advantage of my ears, if you will, and he played me cuts from the Biggie album, In the Making. And then he played me Flavor in Your Ear by Craig Mack. And I knew that this was closer to the street, that this, notwithstanding what we had in urban music with Ray Parker, with Whitney Houston, with Aretha, with Dionne Warwick, and what even The Face had, with the touch of it with TLC and Outkast, that clearing it with L.A. Reid and saying, I think this is really putting us right in the thrust of the new revolution which is occurring. And he readily agreed. And so we did the deal for Bad Boy Records. And then obviously with Biggie, with Puffy, with Mace, he was at the cutting edge, hip hop, learning who to bet on. And what we were able to accomplish, because his vision was to affect Top 40, to change Top 40, because that is the key to big breakout of sales. And so, you know, when that, we did do that, and we did have hit singles. We changed the nature of Top 40, and with hit singles that each of the artists had, Biggie and Mace and Puffy, we exploded sales for hip hop artists way beyond what they had been before. And of course, that ultimately included Outkast. So then all of a sudden, to be competitive in every area, whether you start out in rock, whether it be pop, you know, whether it be R&B, and now the hip hop revolution, to be there at that cutting edge, that's how it took place.
You said you listen to everything that's popular now. Is that right? Do you programmatically listen to everything that's at least on the top 20 or?
I would say that's accurate.
Oh, good. And with all that immersion in contemporary music, has it changed your taste, your personal taste?
I don't even know what personal taste is after all this.
Well, I mean, have you grown to like it more, for instance, than you might have 10 years ago?
I find
Street music.
I'm training what you do when you listen to records when they hit the charts is to train your ears and to see what is happening and what is making inroads, you know, so that, A, I love the process. B, you know, for example, I would not have been the first to hear Mumford & Sons, but as soon as I heard it, they're not my artist, they're not on my label, but I have a party every night, the night before the Grammys, you know, and I have to choose who might be the new artist of the year or what sound is different. And so last year, you know, having heard Mumford & Sons, I put them on way before they broke, you know, really, really big. And so I use it from an educational point of view to keep my ears current, you know, and it's worked.
I'm impressed. When you were a teenager, what did you listen to? What did you love? What music grabbed your heart?
I bet you were I know that you were much more of a music junkie than I was when you were a teenager, and that I got into this business by accident. So for those of you out there, I mean, I didn't train for it. I didn't have a huge record collection. The big popular station in New York, the years that I was growing up, was called the Make Believe Ballroom with Martin Block, and that's what I listened to. And I didn't get out of Brooklyn till I was in my teen years, you know, to see a Broadway show. In those years, what was playing on Broadway was also playing on the radio, so that I would say, no, I was not into Redbird records. I was not into early rock and roll, that was not my hobby. I had to get out of, I had no money. When you're Jewish and you got no money, you become a lawyer or a doctor. So I became a lawyer. And by the quirk of luck, there was an opening 3 years out of law school when I realized the law firm I was with couldn't care less about my client roster or what business I could bring in off the street. I mean, they had CBS as a client and William Paley and Columbia Artists Management Inc. And so I became a lawyer for Columbia Records, and a year later became the general counsel, and that's how I got into music. So my ears, I never knew I had them. I never knew this was going to turn out to be a talent or a gift that I learned to trust. It was a pure accident. It was a lucky break, and I took advantage of it. And it became a lifelong passion, just something that I do love. And there's no limit to the amount of time that I would spend in listening to music and enriching my life in the process.
It's a marvelous story that you went from one thing, you just jumped into it almost blindly, the musical part of it. I guess at Monterey was the place where the epiphany came, wasn't it?
The epiphany came, I had been made 5 years after being the lawyer, president overnight. There was a reorganization of the company. When you find you're with a large company, we had grown. Here's an anecdote for you, where as the chief lawyer, in those days, CBS, on the grounds of synergy, went out acquiring musical instrument companies. So I did the contract for the acquisition of Steinway pianos, for Leslie speakers, for maybe 4 or 5 Fender guitars. And Goddard Lieberson, who was my mentor, who was head of Columbia Records, was a brilliant music man in every respect, was being moved upstairs to be a group president. And one day he called me into his office and he said, there's changes here and I'm going to offer you the head of the musical instrument division because you're the only one that's had contact with every single one of those companies. Well, I was concerned because Fender was the biggest company. They were on the West Coast. I had 2 young children, recently divorced. They lived with me. And I was concerned that I would have to move to the coast and my ex-wives or children's mothers would not be happy with that. So I thought about it overnight. And I was prepared to come in the next morning and say, I appreciate this, but I can't take it. Instead, I get a phone call the minute I arrived, and it was from Goddard, and he said, Clive, come into my office. And I went into his office, and he said, I spoke to Norman Adler, my executive vice president, and I told him what was up. And he asked to be head of the musical instruments division, which included creative playthings, because he wants to go live in La Jolla. So Clive, you can have Columbia Records. And that's truthfully how it happened. So it's not that he saw in me an ear that I was to develop, is my point, nor did I know what was in store for me. But obviously, I owe him everything because he saw other things which enabled me to get that responsibility. But when I took over, and with no musical training, you watch carefully, you listen carefully, you really don't come in as a Mr. Know-it-all. You want to always learn first. You know, first thing I learned is that if you grew up as an A&R man and you grew up with Tony Bennett, Jerry Vale, Percy Faith, Andre Castellanos, you're not going to know rock and roll. And you shouldn't expect them, you know, because I'm listening to MCA and ABC and hearing the variations of music. We had 1, 2, 3 artists in that area. And through a lucky break, the first deal I made as head of the company was with a great producer named Lou Adler, producer of the Mamas and Papas and Johnny Rivers and huge hit records. And we formed Ode Records together. And the first record we had was Scott McKenzie's If You're Going to San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair. And that was going to be the theme of this brand new first pop festival called the Monterey Pop Festival. And I went there with Lou and both our attorney friend, Abe Summer, not knowing that there'd be new artists, just thinking that Simon and Garfunkel and the Mamas and Papas, and we'd have a fun weekend. And I knew I was out of place when I looked and saw what everybody else was wearing. And I was in my khaki pants and a tennis sweater in the midst of these flowing gowns and scarves and colors, and never was I prepared for the social revolution that was taking place, as well as the musical revolution. And you just knew it. You know, when you you use the right word, an epiphany. And I knew that as great as the heritage was of Columbia Records that I inherited, and yet being somewhat tenuous in profitability at this point, I was seeing something with really, I didn't see other competitive executives there. And I saw Big Brother in the holding company. Wasn't even featuring Janis Joplin. It was just Big Brother and the holding company. And when you saw this white soul sister come out, vibrating, electrifying, stuttering, compelling, sweating, with all of her electricity, and you see a group like the Electric Flag, Buddy Miles on drums and Mike Bloomfield on guitar, among other artists that were showcased there, I knew that I had to make a move and that I had to trust my instinct that this was going to be special. And so out of that festival, I signed Big Brother and the holding company. I signed the Electric Flag and prepared to quietly prepare those albums for release, which we did the following year.
We have some pictures of you with various artists, starting with Janis Joplin. Shall we look at them now? And you can talk about... Yeah, there we go. Tell me more about, do you have any anecdotes about Janis?
Well, that picture was taken once the album was done. I asked her to come with me. There's an organization over the years that was so powerful. They were called NARM, National Association of Record Merchandisers. And every rack job was there, as well as major retailers. And I was going to be introducing the group and Electric Flag with a highlight of saying, this will be the sound next heard around the world. And so that picture was taken at that convention where she came down with me. Ultimately, you know, obviously the first artist you sign is special. With her, it became extra special based on the tragic, premature passing of Janis. But I saw many sides to her. You know, the side that was ultimately destructive, live for today and forget about tomorrow. I saw the feminine side of her when I threw a party for her at my apartment after we had our first major success, and I wanted to show her all worlds. So I had Dylan and Miles Davis and Laura Nero and others at this party at my apartment, which she loved. It was a different world. So I have many memories of Janis, all of which are special. And you know, the fact that her albums last the way they do, continue to sell the way they do, and there'll still be another motion picture, I'm sure, of her in the works. Very, very special.
That brings up the, not the problem, but the conflict sometimes between your friendship with an artist and their particular neuroses and problems. And I was thinking particularly of Whitney Houston, who you are really, really close to and have been close to for so long. What's it like when an artist who you're banking on, who's also a close friend, has a meltdown like Whitney's? Do you feel you intervene? Do you try to intervene, or do you stand back? How do you handle that situation?
I was well aware, you know, linking and looking behind right over your shoulder and seeing Janis and knowing what happened to Sly Stone, that questioning what my role coming out of the professional area is in the personal area. In those early years, there's no question I was totally unprepared for the Joplin death. I mean, just not avoiding the Whitney, we'll get into that, but it's hard to give a full answer rather than a soundbite. I was totally unprepared for Janis's death. I never knew the extent of her drug taking. I just knew of Southern Comfort, Jack Daniels. I knew of her drinking, but she had called me literally a week before her death, so excited about her new forthcoming album, and played for me over the phone, me and Bobby McGee, knowing that I had been involved with Chris Christopherson and how she interpreted that song, and so gleeful, so emotional, so thrilled about it. So it was amazing. The early reports is, did she commit suicide? By no means. I mean, she was so into the present, so tragic. You find that professionally, when have been in my position, that artists put on their best face when they see you. It's a big moment for them too. It's their business moment, their professional career status, so that it's very difficult until you experience it yourself if they don't show up. With Whitney, every time, except one, that she was to perform for me, whether it be at my pre-Grammy Gala, where she performed every second or third year, or whether if I was fortunate enough to be honored by a charity that I asked her to come in and sing, or from an album point of view, you know, going through not just the 80s, but going through then with Bodyguard or Preacher's Wife, or, you know, the recording process. She always was on top of her game, so that it did come to a time where I did speak with her about everything that had been written, everything that had been said, because I have a home in Powell Ridge for weekends, about an hour outside of the city in the Bedford area. And it was at the time that Bobby was in jail. And knowing that the responsibility that I really got to speak with her, because what a perfect time, if she did have a problem, for her to go into rehab and deal with it. And then he would have to at the same time. And I had gotten, through mutual friends, a sign from him that if I spoke to her, that he would go into rehab separately, because unless both went separately, but at the same time, it would never work in a household. So I did speak with Whitney there on a one-to-one. And although, you know, artists tend to surround themselves with staff, a lot of people that are in the payroll or a family, and they don't bring up controversial subjects. Whitney never said that's off limit. We talked about it. She didn't commit the way she committed to what she was going through when she spoke on the Oprah show with her interview. But she said she's not ready. It's not as bad as I've heard or what my imagination would be. And, you know, it gets down to the adage that we know as all human beings, that the person involved either has to sink that low that he or she is ready on their own, can't be imposed by someone who has a business, albeit personal, relationship. As a rule, though, I have always been available professionally, really from the morning till late at night, on weekdays usually. I try to keep weekends free for personal life, for seeing my family every Sunday night. We always have dinner with my 4 children and grandchildren to this day. And it's not that you're not friendly, but it's not, we all have our different styles. I mean, years ago when David Geffen was growing up, I mean, I think Laura lived in his house, or Joni Mitchell lived in his house, and Jackson Brown or David Crosby, you know, I'm not that way. They could reach me in my office every night till 8 or 8:30 to this day, and they know that I'm available on that basis. But I don't get into their personal life beyond that. But getting back to the Whitney example, we did talk. And yes, it's been very upsetting that someone who has the gift, as she has, you know, has had the problems that she's admitted to having gone through in the life, you know, in that manner.
You still have an ongoing business relationship, right? She's still, yes. Okay, well, let's pray that she just gets it back.
Yes, I mean, I fervently hope that she does.
The next one is Barry Manilow. Anything to say?
I have a lot to say. No, you know, one day I will write a book incorporating a lot of these stories and a lot of the relationships that I had. A very special relationship with Barry, and how it's evolved over the years, because you know, the business is transitory, so much is ephemeral, so much you don't know what is going to last. But when we got together in 1974, And to the extent that we have worked together over each of the decades, in different manners, in different ways. I mean, the key thing with Barry was that he viewed his primary strength, and he's so gifted as a composer and as an arranger. Look how he's arranged for Bette Midler and so many other artists. He's very, very, very gifted. And I always saw him, however, as a great entertainer. I signed him when I saw him open for Dionne Warwick in Central Park. I didn't know that he had this dream of being the composer solely. And so I immediately heard the material. I knew it was a new era for me. Arista Records, named after my high school honor society. And so I heard his material. I didn't hear a single. There was a song I heard. It was called Brandy. When it got to me, I changed the name to Mandy because I had a record when I was head of Columbia on Epic Records called Brandy, Looking Glass. Brandy, you're a fine one. And it went to #1. So we changed the name, and I changed it to a rhyme of Mandy and worked with Barry on the arrangement because I heard it as a ballad, not as an up-tempo number. And when I gave him that lead, he, with his great arrangement skills, made this record. So there was no anxiety with Arista. The first record that came out went straight to #1. And I've been fortunate in that respect because it happened later with J Records as well. And he gave me 2 songs per album. He says, I'm going to write everything. And you come up with 2 songs. So I had to make those 2 songs work. And I've got to say, and I say it proudly, I made those songs work. So whether it was trying to get the feeling again, whether it was Weekend in New England, whether it was Looks Like We Made It, whether it was I Write the Songs, and there's stories to each of them when he hated I Write the Songs and took